some head kicks before he was able to, really adapt to that stimulus and be able to perform. So again, I think it's one of those things that maybe thinking about crowds and the nature of COVID that we're in right now, fighting in empty arenas, this may put these fighters at a disadvantage for performance. Another study looking at the epigenetics of mixed martial arts fighters in comparison to active controls. We had a population of 21 MMA, 17 controls in which RNA was extracted, and essentially looking at the microRNA disposition after all is said and done for certain things like cancerous, chronic inflammatory response markers, autoimmune disease, the list goes on and what we were trying to do. If you think of microRNA, you probably see a lot of this on the news right now. Essentially, we're looking at the microRNA expression in terms of disease and treatment. So you're seeing a lot of that research right now in light of the COVID. Again, these probably are a bit confusing when you're looking at this at the bottom. Essentially, the red is what we think of as basically a great disposition for it, and on the bottom would be the fighters. So when you're comparing these three, essentially what sticks out to me, and you probably can't see it, I sort of did a bad job on expressing this, there's going to be certain boxes that are expressions known for disposition to cancer, that, chronic inflammatory response and autoimmune disease. When you compare this active, healthy control to the mixed martial arts fighters, you're going to see that the mixed martial arts fighters express a better disposition for lack of cancerous tissue, a better inflammatory response to chronic damage, and probably less susceptible to autoimmune diseases in the big scheme of things. So in terms of genetic quality, tissue quality, microRNA quality, they're probably dispositioned for healthier life moving forward. Sleep habits. We've also focused on sleep. We have a sort of a small sample size here. It's an N of 8, but I think this is very unique in those of you that have seen The Ultimate Fighter in the past. We were able to actually utilize basically a specific team or a group on The Ultimate Fighter of the UFC. So those of you that have been able to watch that show, you can think about the research process, and this was a little bit unique in the idea that, it is somewhat controlled based on schedule, no technology. They're forced to go to bed at a certain time, lights out, cameras, production, those kind of things, but a bit uncontrolled in what we think of as research. So I think this is more real life application as opposed to everything completely ironed out. But I do think there was a lot of control in this study. We're looking at a 6-week period where training took place 1 to 2 times a day, and there were exhibition bouts that were, basically competition fights that occurred throughout this, what I want to call an in-camp period. 3 different markers that we utilized. We used something known as sleep latency. And as you can see with sleep latency, that was a variable that was basically significant or correlated with cardiovascular health, with injury prevention during this 6-week period, and also power output based on some of the testing that we're utilizing through power assessments and other things like that. If you actually look at sleep latency in terms of what it's defined as, it's essentially consistency in times in which it's going to take you to fall asleep. So if you lay down and you essentially, are going to bed, you're going to fall asleep relatively quickly as opposed to when you actually lay down. Sleep efficiency is going to be basically what you think of when you think of that sleep parameter, quality of sleep, deepness of sleep, and that showed a significant correlation with cardiovascular health and performance, VO2 max, recovery, and different things like that. And sleep onset was the last variable that also showed a significant correlation with the number of sessions missed. So over the course of the period, athletes had a certain, obviously injuries, wear and tear, overtraining, and things like that, where some athletes had to sit out sessions. There was a correlation here that showed that sleep onset being consistent actually led to less sessions being missed during the 6-week period. So again, I think it kind of contradicts a little bit what we think of in terms of sleep research, where I think we've heard the standard 7 to 9 hours, this amount of time sleeping is the most important thing. It was actually interesting because we utilized those variables and there was no correlation with performance over that 6-week period. The biggest takeaway from this was that consistency and really utilizing these rest and recovery periods more efficiently led to greater performance, higher neural function, higher power output, cardiovascular health over that 6-week period. Now, again, some of these individuals are only sleeping anywhere between maybe 5 and 6 hours over the course of this 6 weeks. So I think that this is something that's necessarily sustainable 365 days a year, multiple years during the career. I do not, but I think this short window known as camp, where you really want a high neural drive and adequate recovery, I think for that 6-week period, this was efficient and obviously showed significant correlations to certain variables associated with performance, fighting, etc. The last study that I want to go over that we are doing here at Nova Southeastern University is an emotion, cognition, and biomarkers of inflammation and a study. So again, this was compared with NFL athletes. So it's actually really interesting thinking that we had 9 NFL, either current or recently retired athletes. Same thing for the mixed martial arts, either current or recently retired. And then a professional athlete control pool. So basically non-football, non-MMA, less contact, but professional athlete in that actual control. We looked at a neurobehavioral assessment using the NIH toolbox, and we also utilized biomarkers associated with cognition and emotion. It was interesting because when you look at the NFL athletes, when compared to the mixed martial arts athletes and the professional control, they actually exhibited greater anger from the emotional standpoint, and they had a decreased pro-inflammatory cytokine response, meaning that they actually showed a disposition to recover less rapidly than the other two populations. And you think about the game of football and 16 weeks in a row of beating the body down. What's the long-term effects of this and the wear and tear? And I think, research is starting to show a lot of this. When you looked at the MMA population in regards to both the NFL and the professional athlete control, they showed a decrease in inhibitory control and processing speed. So there was more of an emotional and, inflammatory biomarker association with the American football players, and more of a cognitive impairment when you were looking at the mixed martial arts athletes in comparison to one another and in comparison to the professional athlete control. Kind of leads you to the question I have actually a client that Chris and I both work with, Matt Mitrione here at the bottom, professional NFL player, now professional fighter for a long period of time. What are the repercussions? Hopefully nothing, but again, I think things that we can't answer at the time, but I think research is starting to enhance. Okay, so enough of what we're doing at Nova Southeastern University, but let's kind of move into some of the traditional research. A lot of these articles have been shared throughout the group that I have here, Doug Coleman, a lot of other people, basically just looking at the weight cutting process in general. So let's first get a generalization. When we look at rapid weight loss, a lot of the different research out there is going to probably analyze a couple of different methods. Obviously, looking at calorie restriction, fluid restriction, looking at the diuretic effect between, either sweating or laxatives, whatever the case might be, other aids and stuff like that. We have seen a ton of this data showing obviously a decrease in mental acuity, strength, mood, more or less on the acute side of actual measuring things. And in terms of binge eating, we typically have seen that as a rebound response to some of these, calorie deprived or restricted type athletes. So let's look first at Division I NCAA wrestlers. I forget what the N number was of this, but there was basically an assessment looking at the course of tournament week. And this is essentially 5 matches in which these individuals would probably lose about 6% of their body weight within that 1 week period over the course of these 5 matches. And again, probably a lot of up and down in this regard. But again, that was probably the most extreme case from start to finish would be that 6%. Not saying that they were there the entire week, but probably pretty common, 6% when they stepped on the scale, 3 to 4% when they were probably competing would be my guess. And in fact, there were impairments in testosterone, elevated cortisol levels, lactate levels post those 5 matches. A little bit inconsistent when we were looking at some of the catecholamines, but changes in epinephrine, norepinephrine were also very apparent in terms of being impaired over the course of this, course of this 1 week period. Sort of leads you to suggest thinking about realistically looking at the season as a whole, probably not common for them to have 2 to 3 matches per week, back to back to back weeks. This is sort of the extreme looking at tournament time. But again, think about that over the course of the entire competitive season. So again, that leads me into the next study, kind of the follow-up of what I saw there. And this was done at Purdue University, utilizing the collegiate wrestling team, looking at different things like resting metabolic rate, the effect of training, nutrition on these things. But I think the biggest takeaway was kind of to the question that I previously posed as to what are the effects over the course of the season. And they essentially did a retest of resting metabolic rate from pre to post. And they saw that there was a significant impairment of resting metabolic rate of nearly 200 calories during the course of the season for all of these athletes. Now, we're looking at a population ranging probably anywhere from 18 to 22 years old. And within 6 weeks of that post retest, they were tested again, and that normalization of resting metabolic rate was found, and they were back to normal within 6 weeks of post competition. Again, what are the causes after 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, and then you go into something like MMA or combat sports, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all the way as long as Chris has been doing it, upwards of probably close to 20 years now. NCAA sort of utilized some of this and have now forced body composition testing preseason to determine healthy weight loss for wrestlers. So again, we're looking at body composition. And so that sort of asked me, is it fat-free mass? Is it fat mass? What are the variables here that are associated with this body composition testing? So when looking at actual body composition in terms of performance effects, when you look at the mean power in terms of fat-free mass levels, there is a direct correlation between these, meaning that with fat-free mass levels, there's going to be essentially, as those drop, there's also going to be a drop in power output, which I think is actually really interesting. In terms of strength, there was no fat mass and strength correlation. So realistically, it kind of answers that question. If we're using fat-free mass levels and designing training programs for power, and we should be using fat mass levels to determine healthy weight loss programs for the competitive season. And I think, Tony's been a big advocate for this for a long time, especially when we look at just weight cutting in general. Even though there might not be a significant correlation with performance, let's say, we know damn well it's going to be easier to make weight, being that we have more fat-free mass and lower fat mass. So I think that's advantageous in its own right when we look at weight cutting as a whole. So let's look at weight cycling, probably something wrestlers do, boxers, anybody that's in a weight-restricted sport. We're going to lose a lot of weight to compete. We're going to rebound. We're going to gain that weight until we enter camp. We're going to lose, and our cycle goes like this for a long period of time. And this was a cool study out of Finland that analyzed roughly 2,000 athletes from those weight-restricted sports such as weightlifting, wrestling, boxing, etc. And they were matched with more weight-stable sports throughout this thing. And it was really interesting because they assessed changes in BMI rather than body fat. But again, I think this was an easier way because if you look at it, they were actually looking at this for almost a 45-year period following retirement in sports. So again, I think that this correlates, I think this provides a lot of insight, even if we are utilizing BMI. If you looked at the cycling sports, you were going to see a gain of 5.2 BMI units for those weight cycling sports. Controls, 4.2, which over time reduced to 3.3. So again, what is this saying? We are gaining weight as athletes following competition, And again, I think that makes sense. I mean, you know, as you age, I think people think you lose muscle, you gain fat, but as a whole, typically body weight's going to potentially drop over time. Well, with these weight restricted athletes or just intense athletes to begin with, the demands of, you know, caloric expenditure that required by their sport show sort of a different trend later on in life following sports. So I think it's definitely an interesting take. And again, it shows weight cycling does appear to predispose obesity and increase body mass later on in life. So should there be the potential for post-career counseling? And what does this say about competing in these weight-restricted sports? Finally, let's look at meal frequency. And this was in boxers, where both boxers were on a 120 calorie per day for 2 weeks, which is absurd in its own right. Again, I'm hoping that these athletes were the smallest weight class possible, but they weren't. Relatively high body fat, looking at these in terms of 17% body fat and energy expenditure of roughly 3,000 calories. So calorie restricted in the most part, and then altering meal frequency between 2 and 6. Both groups lost essentially over 10 pounds with no difference between the groups in body fat change. However, there was a significant decrease in fat-free mass for those that only ate twice versus 6 times. So again, you kind of ask that, how is there no difference in body fat, body weight, but there is in this? Probably water retention and things that are associated with fat-free mass. So that probably makes up for the additional, 1 to 2 kilos. So in terms of the implication, even if these calories are being split, the 2 meals is not enough to support during weight loss for many of the physiological variables, including body composition that we just discussed here. So with that said, I'm going to let Chris go into the nuts and bolts behind this. What I'm presenting to you is a lot of the research that is currently being utilized. Let's go back to where I started in some of the first 4 research studies that we're doing at Nova Southeastern. A lot of my athletes, whether they are subjects or whether we are utilizing the same procedures that we used for those research protocols, it gives us a lot of information about the fighters that I have in terms of sleep habits, in terms of genetic disposition, in terms of how they're going to perform in stressful situations, in terms of the amount of volume we can put on those athletes. That it's a basic analysis of blood, spit. A lot of the other things we're going to do in lab in terms of body composition, power, aerobic, those are going to help me profile how to build a proper strength and conditioning program for these athletes. Now, looking at the weight cutting side of things, which Chris is going to really give you an in-depth look at how to sustain weight and how to weight cut, you have the information that I just provided to you in terms of the short-term and long-term effects of weight cycling, weight restriction. So I ask, again, to you as the crowd, is weight cutting safe? I have one of my athletes here, Unglan Sang, Chris as well, works with him, and he's a different entity in its own right, where he's fighting for one championship, and there's no weight cutting in this organization. Now, he's a little bit tricky in the regards that he's a 2 weight class champion, so we do have to cycle his weight a little bit. But realistically, when he's fighting for the light heavyweight, he's underweight by 6 to 7 pounds. When he's fighting middleweight, he's really probably only overweight about 6 to 7 pounds throughout the entire camp. So in my mind, hearing those numbers, I know some of you may be thinking that's still weight to cut. To me, that's let's go throw a sweatsuit on for a half an hour and you're on weight. So, I don't think of that as weight cutting. And to be honest with you, ever since he stopped cutting weight, he's been on a surgence. He's probably won 13 out of his last 15 fights, 2 division champion, and I would say probably almost all of those fights are finishes, where during some of the weight restriction and, at this point in time, not really having a team around him, some of his performances were a bit subpar compared to where he is now. So again, I kind of propose that question. What I want to do after asking that question is just show you some examples of real life weight cutting. So when we actually look at this for the mixed martial arts side of things, I'm giving you 135, 145, 55, 170. Just so you are on the same page as me, this is either a UFC, a Bellator, or a one championship athlete. So again, this is going to be your top of the line athletes. Let's look at the 170 cut, for instance, and just kind of go over it. I think you look at where this athlete was at 8 weeks, and you can see they were 194.5 pounds at a very low 6.2% body fat. 3 weeks, 185.1 at a very even lower 4.7% body fat. 1 week, 182.4 at 3.4% body fat, weighed in at 170.1 for that actual weigh-in. 24 to 36 hours post, depending on what the organization was, we were at 184.1 pounds on fight day. So again, I pose that question, is this safe? I want you to look at the fighter below. As you can see, that's Danny Roberts, a very successful UFC fighter, a very entertaining UFC fighter. This was one of his documented weight cuts. And in terms of his performance, he actually went out, knocked the guy out with the left hook in about 1:30. So again, I asked the question, is it safe? That's up for you to, that's up for your decision, your expertise. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of a little bit of the larger individuals, we have a 185-pound athlete, a 205, and I think the 265-pound athlete's a little bit fun, just looking at the size of this individual being out of weight at 295 pounds, about 14% body fat, 3 weeks out, 287 pounds, 1 week out, 178 pounds, weighing in at 265 and fighting at 284. And again, I realize those numbers are a little bit drastic, but you have to take into account percentages as opposed to the actual number of, you know, where they're at. So again, I think that's a really interesting take of maybe not necessarily what's ideal according to your resources, your education, your background, but it's what's real. And this is what's happening at the highest level. So again, I think that's the research basis. I think this is a good time to hand this off to Chris, who's going to essentially tell you how that's possible. If you're looking at those numbers and thinking this just doesn't make any sense, he's going to be able to kind of give you the nuts and bolts of how this is. You know, Dr. Antonio alluded to what Chris is doing, but you guys also have to understand, I've worked with Chris for multiple camps with multiple athletes. Chris is a two-sport world champion, which essentially puts him in the categories of a very rare case of, potentially your Klitschko, two combat athlete. I can't even think of two sport combat world champion. So he's going to give you a lot of good insight. If you have any questions, reach out to me at Dr. C. Peacock or cpeacock@nova.edu. Thanks to Dr. Antonio, Dr. Coleman, Dr. Tartar, Dr. Ricci, Dominic Cabrera, and Julius Thomas, whose research we posed. And again, on the right-hand side, Dr. Antonio said, obviously he and I work together at Nova Southeastern University, a master's degree in sports science, where the majority of this research is taking place. There's a QR code there if you want to scan that, if you're interested in looking at the program. Brand new program, a lot of really cool research in the field of sports science, particularly mixed martial arts, NFL combat athletes, and honestly an area where a lot more research needs to take place. So if you have questions, obviously reach out to me. There's also the link to the actual program itself.
Thank you, Dr. Peacock. If you have a quick moment, there is one question. Let me read it off to you. It's in the Q&A box. It says, some research has noted that a short sleep latency under 5 minutes means you're potentially not sleeping enough, and that those who train at a higher intensity may experience longer sleep latency, greater than 30 minutes. Then again, exercise can improve sleep latency. So have you noticed something similar with your fighters? And was there a correlation showing that a short sleep latency is what improved their power output, etc.? I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I'm not familiar with that research particularly, but I definitely will say there were with the variables that I showed, even if it wasn't significant, there were trends for significance in all three of those variables with some of the power output testing that we were doing with the VO2 max, the aerobic testing, and those kind of things. So again, it didn't match significance, but honestly, I don't want to throw out the number, but the research article, I want to say we were probably at like 0.057 or something like that. So really, really close trends. I think if the sample size would have been a little bit larger, we probably would have saw significance.
Also, one other
but
thing.
Again, I'm inferring.
Right. Someone had texted saying that it looks like you can predict actual fight day weight by just looking at 3 weeks pre. It looked like the numbers were very similar when you look at their weight 3 weeks before and then their weight 24 hours after the cut.
I will allow Chris. Yeah, Dr. Antonio, you're cutting out a little bit, but I think I got the gist of what you said, and I will let Chris cover that. There is a specific reason why that 3-week number is essentially the same number that you're going to see on fight day.
Chris,
Perfect.
take it away.
Segue. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Dr. Jose Antonio and Dr. Corey Peacock. Fantastic presentation, and leads me right into my talk. So let me just share these slides. One second here. There we go. Now, trying to get this into full screen. Okay, we good? Okay, so we're talking sports nutrition, the real world application for fight sports. And okay. So combat sports, we've got 3 of the top performing athletes of the last generation. We've got Floyd Money Mayweather, the undefeated 50-0 highest paid athlete in the history of sports. Obviously in MMA, we've got Conor McGregor down there, another very highly paid fighter in MMA. And then we've got Olympic gold medalist in the corner there. So with combat sports, they all have something in common. That is, they're all highly physical. They're one-on-one sports. They're high contact sports. Training lasts seasons, months, years. The training volume is incredibly high. The physical output, the metabolic demand, they're also, skill sports. So cognition, mental has to do with that as well. It's important to train all aspects for these particular sports. And most importantly, for what we're talking about today, for what I'm talking about specifically today, is that they're all weight category sports, meaning that generally we are treating these athletes as if they are higher performance vehicles with low body mass and high output, high horsepower. Tony Ricci always alludes to fighters as being high performance vehicles with high horsepower and low body weight. So it's very important to have a low body percentage, a body fat percentage with a high lean tissue mass, so they can perform. So nutrition, of course, plays a vital role in all sports, but most importantly, and specifically to weight category sports such as this, where you have to make the weight before you can compete. And ultimately, guys will do anything they can to get a competitive advantage, to be the larger athlete, the heavier athlete, and especially sports like MMA or wrestling or anything where there's wrestling or jiu-jitsu rather is involved, where body mass, body size will ultimately play a big role in the fight itself. Less so in boxing, which you will see less aggressive weight making techniques utilized by boxers rather than MMA fighters, wrestlers, jiu-jitsu athletes. Because of that reason, there's not that overlying body weight that matters as much in a pure striking sport like boxing or kickboxing. I put this up here because I know Dr. Jose Antonio is a huge boxing fan. He likes the classics. You get an idea looking at these photos about how intense fights can be and the level of fitness that these athletes need to be in order to compete at the highest level. And we are looking at some of the highest level athletes in the world in these photos. So nutrition plays such a big role in these sports, like I said, but ultimately I think the most interesting aspect of sports nutrition for combat athletes is the actual weight making process, and something that I think a lot of people do not understand or can wrap their head around. I've spoken to many RDs and many nutritionists and people who look through the numbers and they're like, this doesn't make sense. How can these athletes lose this amount of weight in such a short period of time? Coming into fight weeks and a fighter will be 10, 15 pounds overweight just days before making weight or stepping on the scale, and then have to go and compete for 12 rounds or 5-minute rounds in a championship MMA fight. And people are completely blown away at the numbers and how it's possible to do. But as Dr. Corey Peacock alluded to, this is something that is common practice, and that not only have I done myself, but I've done it countless times with other athletes. And it's pretty amazing what the fighters at the highest level put their bodies through in order to perform the way that they do. And we're going to kind of go over what that process looks like, how it is actually possible, and potentially any kind of risks involved with the process itself. And then posing the question that Corey talked about was, is this safe? Is this how it's going to be? And is there a way to make it safer if it's not? So what the research says is that if the fighter's in shape, the athlete's in shape with a proper training nutrition program, they shouldn't be anywhere above their weight class, but between 5 to 8%. That if you're more than 8% up to 10% body above your weight class, you're probably in the wrong weight class. You shouldn't be competing, and that it can be very dangerous and should not even be attempted. Cutting weight incorrectly, improperly, or rehydrating yourself can not only ruin your training and your performance, but put you in a very dangerous position in terms of health. Ideally, an athlete will have 8 to 10 to 12 weeks in order to get ready for a championship level fight. They can slowly, chronically lose weight over time. A few pounds a week, 1 to 2 pounds, is shown to be safe. Generally, I tell my guys, in an ideal situation, if you have that amount of time, 2-3 months, to train, that you want to begin your training camp no more than 15% above the contracted weight, so you can really work on your skills leading up to the event, make the weight safely, and be healthy and energetic on fight night. So slowly losing body fat throughout the training camp, getting yourself leaner, like I talked about from the outset, being lean with a low body fat percentage and have a high lean tissue is important for a fighter. So slowly losing that weight over time, decreasing the body fat on the scale. And Dr. Corey Peacock does a lot of the body fat percentage of his fighters, and he's got guys that are as low as 5-6% body fat, when they're getting ready to step on the scale for fight week, and sometimes even lower. So that's something that takes a lot of time. You're not gonna get that level of leanness quickly or overnight or any kind of acute weight loss strategy. So that takes a tremendous amount of preparation in terms of training and nutrition in order to get yourself into that position to be that low in body fat. So Corey mentioned, so there was a question about the 3 weeks out. This is something that I was going to talk about a little bit later, but that's the idea there, that is by design. We want the 3 weeks out and the fight day weight to be about the same. And the reason for that is that 3 weeks out from a fight is where the bulk of the performance sparring is done. So that's when the athlete is going to be properly fueled, sparring the most rounds, and where the sparring, which is they practice fighting, for those of you who don't know, that's where the athlete is going to be in the body that they're going to be when they're in the ring. So they want to be able to perform. They want to know their body. They want to be boxing or fighting at the same body weight that they're going to be in the ring, so they understand what their body is like at that time. If you got a guy who makes a weight and then puts on 15, 20 pounds, but he's used to sparring with only 10 pounds above his weight division, it's almost like he's in a different body and may not perform the same way. So we do that by design. About 3 weeks out is generally the meat of the hard sparring. Once we get a little closer to that, within the 3 weeks time, it's more focused on technique, making weight. We don't want the athlete to get damaged. So the harder sparring is not going to be done in the last 3 week block. So if their weight is a little bit off there, that's okay. But 3 weeks out, that's when the athlete is going to be performing closest to what they're going to be on fight night. That's why we want their body weight to be about the same. Generally, when we're working with guys in the ideal situation, we want them to be training to get better, not to make weight, which unfortunately, that's not always the case. The reality is that oftentimes fighters are losing tremendous amount of weight throughout their training camp, aren't working on their skills as much, or they've done it incorrectly, don't have a systematic approach with their diet and nutrition, then are forced to really focus on losing that weight the last month or 4 or 5 weeks. And that can take away from a lot of the gains that were made during the training camp or early in the camp. So generally, I mean, we see guys that are 10 to 12% above their body weight the week of the fight. I talked about being at least, that very max 15% at the beginning of training camp, 3 months out. We got guys who are 5 days out who are 10 to 12% over their weight class and make it just fine. And that's something I want to add to it too. They make it just fine. They go out there, they perform great. So it's not necessarily not possible or is going to hurt them. Guys do it all the time. Oftentimes we don't get the ideal situation where we have a 10, 12-week camp where fighters will take fights on short notice, especially now, currently what we're dealing with the pandemic. Fights are dropping all over the place. And guys are showing up, testing positive, and have to pull fighters on a few days' notice. A lot of fighters are just staying in shape, quote unquote, fight ready, which I don't really think is a thing. Being fight ready and being in shape are two very different things. But this is something that we deal with as coaches quite a bit, and myself as a fighter. Certain opportunities arise, and this could be a big opportunity for your career, and you take it. You take it, you make the weight, and you go out there and try to seize the best for yourself and your career. Also, when you look at the highest level of these athletes, generally the higher the level, the more money that's on the line, the more time that's invested, the more aggressive the weight making techniques become from the fighters themselves. And we're also talking about millions of dollars are on the line for these fighters. I talked about Floyd Money Mayweather being the highest paid athlete in the world, who makes upwards of $100 million when he fights. Canelo Alvarez averages about $35 million a fight, I believe. And then even guys like in MMA, like Conor McGregor, who I mentioned earlier, he's another one who's looking at several millions of dollars each and every time he fights. So the risk versus reward is there for these athletes, and they're willing to lose that 10, 12, 15% of their body weight in order to carry some type of competitive advantage on fight night. At this level, it's 0.5% can be the difference between getting that win, getting that fight night bonus, getting that next $1 million payday. So for these fighters, there's no question about whether the risk is worth or the juice is worth the squeeze, rather, if putting their bodies at risk making this weight. So it's kind of two things to talk about here. There's weight loss versus the weight cut, right? So a lot of times people say, well, I'm cutting weight and they're several weeks or months out. That's not really true. You're trying to lose weight at that point, and that's a chronic weight reduction over time. This is what we generally think of traditional weight loss. We're reducing our we're reducing our body fat percentage, which always comes with a little bit of lean tissue loss as well. But generally, this is a process of calories in versus calories out. An unbelievable amount of dietary plans are out there that way. And the way I always look at it is every diet works as long as you do it, right? And so whatever an athlete utilizes in order to lose weight over time, as long as they are energetic and able to perform and train to the highest ability, then that's fine by me. I know I have athletes that use paleo. I have athletes that like to go low fat, or they carb restrict. I generally like to use some carb cycling techniques with my athletes when it is this time to lose the weight, focusing their carbohydrate intake around their tempo workouts or their high performance workouts like sparring and whatnot, and limiting carbohydrates around cardio or non-performance based sessions. And we've had really good success with that, guys getting leaner up to their fight, but also having enough energy to train properly and be fit for fight night. And then when you're talking about weight cut, you're talking about an acute weight reduction. Oftentimes, a lot of athletes will use this as kind of the bulk of how they make weight. That can be very dangerous. Like I said, it can be very damaging to your training. It can be very damaging to your body. And a lot of times I've seen guys who have ruined training camps because of their weight cutting practices leading up to the fight, even just several days before the fight, which any coaches on here can speak to fighters who have done that. And for the most part, we're going to get into like the nitty gritty of how we're able to do that. But fighters are able to reduce 10 to 50% of their body mass in a matter of days, which is very aggressive and seems kind of nuts, but we've seen it time and time again. So weight loss, again, I talked about energy requirements, calories in versus calories out. Just a few things that can affect that: your resting metabolic rate, your NEAT, which that non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which it accounts for a tremendous amount of your calories. A lot of people don't really take that into account. Athletes, especially, and guys who are in that weight reduction phase, I tell them as much as possible to rest, put your feet up, because walking around and being physically busy can sap a lot of those calories that you may need for your training as you're getting closer to fight night, and every calorie counts. Also, the thermic effect of the food that you do eat, and that's when we get to really sit down and manipulate the macronutrients that are going into our athletes to make sure that they are maximizing their energy expenditure, but also in a caloric deficit so they can lose weight. And then, of course, physical activity, which is the most variable, which for a training camp or an athlete or a fighter is tremendously high, and but also very variable, because I've worked with athletes who are hard chargers and like to go overboard in terms of their training, and I've worked with guys who are extremely lazy, who don't like to do the extra stuff, who don't want to train that hard, who kind of half-ass their way through their workouts. This is some of the information, some of the research out there. It's not really a difference in the amount of weight loss on a low carbohydrate versus a low fat diet. And whenever you are losing weight, you're not just losing body fat, you're generally going to lose some lean tissue as well. And because of that, I tell all my guys to up their protein intake, really focus on that, even when you're in a caloric deficit. Protein. I know Jose and Dr. Antonio loves that. He is the protein king. Rapid weight loss, very, very different. This is the cutting weight that we think of when we think of fight sports. Athletes use a tremendous amount of varying techniques in order to rapidly lose weight, generally losing body water, not eating food, fasting. Dr. Peacock had some of that up there on his slides as well. I don't recommend any of this, but let's talk about what the weight cut done well looks like. Even in the aggressive states that we're talking about, the weight cutting process. There's Kamaru Usman, who Dr. Corey Peacock works with, tremendous specimen. Another guy who very, very large for his weight class. He is the champion, which, like I said, the elite level guys, the highest level guys, are very aggressive in terms of their weight cuts. And even himself, a champion that he is, will cut a tremendous amount of weight fight week. But it can be done. It can be done in a way that is not only possible but safe as well, what I think. So you've got that acute weight reduction, which is that last pretty much week, that fight week, which at that point the output and training volume has gone down tremendously. Most fighters are really just kind of focusing on their fight night specific techniques, but also making the weight. A few things that we can manipulate in that last week are your gut contents, which matters what kinds of food you eat. Low residue diets are really beneficial for that. Your muscle glycogen, which is going to be directly related to your carbohydrate intake that last week, which can be decreased very, very quickly in just a matter of days. So we don't have to worry about this stuff exactly until like the last couple of days. Your liver glycogen, which you're not going to mess with too much, and then your body water, which is tremendously variable. So like I said, the low residue diet for a few days to empty out the gut contents can be a loss of several pounds, and then gradually reducing your carbohydrate intake depending on how much you're training that last fight week in order to reduce the glycogen within your skeletal muscle tissue, but also the water that's associated with that glycogen storage. And then lastly, we're gonna do a low sodium to almost no sodium diet for the last couple of days in order to help maintain that water loss over those days. And then lastly, at that point, just workouts. You know, I don't work out a whole lot the week of the fight, but I will do several what I call push workouts the last day or last 20 hours prior to the weigh-in, just to kind of make sure that we're kind of wringing out any of that last body water that could be stored within the skeletal muscle tissue. And so I'm sure we've heard of actually, let me talk about this one first. I really like this. This is something actually that Corey had put together, kind of the stepwise process of what it looks like fight week. So you decrease in your carbohydrate, lowering your glycogen stores. You start to decrease and eventually eliminate your sodium so your body doesn't hold on to the water. And then lastly, you're going to decrease and eliminate that water. Literally, the decrease in water content is only about the last day or so. I don't like my guys to be dehydrated for too long. I don't like to be dehydrated for very long. I want to be dehydrated for an hour. I want to make the weight, step on the scale, put it right back in. And this kind of shows that exact process in reverse. So the way that we took out those different variables is the way we want to put them back in. So right after the weigh-in, you're going to increase the sodium, increase your water intake, increase glycogen so you have that skeletal muscle glycogen replenished so you can perform on fight night. And then you're going to introduce solids, body and fat back into your diet to get your hormone levels, insulin, blood sugar all in place, so you can pretty much be the exact person that you were during training camp come fight day. Generally, the athletes that we deal with at the professional levels have anywhere from 24 to 28, sometimes even 30 hours between weigh-in and fight time. So a tremendous amount of time to rehydrate, refuel, and put the weight back on. I want to go back to the water loading real quick. I'm sure you guys have all heard about water loading. This is a very, very basic just description of water loading. This is something that's been utilized by powerlifters for years, bodybuilders, things like that. It's been adapted into fight sports. And the idea here is that we're preparing our body, preparing our tissues to do the water cut, where you cut your water down, you lower your sodium. So the idea here is that we're going to hyperhydrate in the days leading up. This one says 5 days. That's generally about what I do with my guys as well. 5 days out, you're drinking as much as 2 gallons of water for 2 days, and then you're going to systematically cut that down. You're going to have it day by day leading up to the stepping on the scale. And what's happening here is you're hyperhydrating the body, hyperhydrating your tissue, and it's going to upregulate your body's diuresis or decreasing of your body water. Okay, and what happens then? You get to the point where you have limited your sodium, you've taken all the glycogen out of your body. There's nothing for your body to hold on to that water. And then you do a couple workouts. Maybe you do a hot sauna, you do a hot bath, and that kind of pushes out that extra water that our body can no longer hold on to. And you're able to pull off a tremendous amount of weight and body water prior to the weigh-in. So as a coach, you know, our job is always to maximize the potential of the athlete that we're working with. When it comes to nutrition, you're not going to make the athlete better. You just want them to be themselves. So many of the athletes that we deal with hurt themselves on the way to the weigh-in because of the tactics that they use in order to make weight. So ideally, we want them to be the athlete that they are. We want them to perform at their best. We want them to have enough energy and to be healthy, and also to be hydrated, because it is very dangerous to go into a fight sport in any type of way dehydrated or low energy. So making sure that they are properly fueled, properly hydrated, and ready to perform at their best is most important, because the reality of fight sports is that it's extremely dangerous. Fighters die every year. Boxers, I looked it up, I believe 13 professional boxers died last year. We don't have as many deaths in MMA. The talent pool isn't as big. Also, just kind of the mechanics of the sport are a little different. But still, there is just a tremendous amount of damage involved with both these sports, even if MMA fighters aren't dying per se. So talking about that particular thing, I wanted to always make this a point. These are 3 of the young boxers who died last year. And I know I actually I've known all 3 of them. One of them is very very close friend of mine. The other 2 acquaintances, but these are very young guys who are very good, very, very good records. They all are under the age of 28 years old. This all happened last year in the span of probably about 18 months that these athletes 2 of them died, one of which is permanently damaged. And 2 out of the 3 were undefeated, which is not something that we've normally seen in the past. But I do know personally that all 3 of these athletes cut a lot of weight. And I was not involved in their camps per se, but I do know that some of the weight making strategies utilized by a couple of these guys were extremely aggressive, not the smartest, not the most systematic approach that I've ever seen. And it's hard to not think about that when you're seeing something like this with these young athletes who are in the peak and prime of their physical lives are being permanently damaged or die on fight nights. So just let me do a little bit of my own kind of research. There's not a whole lot out there, but dehydration does play a major role in head trauma. You know, your cerebral spinal fluid is fluid. You know, the volume of your brain within your cranium does change in a dehydrated state. So there is an increased risk of permanent damage to the brain when someone is in a dehydrated state and suffers some kind of trauma. So think about these athletes who maybe not have rehydrated properly leading up to their fight, did not do the systematic approach that we talked about, making sure that they're putting the electrolytes, carbohydrates back into their system, allowing their bodies to be properly hydrated, and then going into one of the most dangerous positions you could ever be in, which is a fight with another professional fighter. So something that's important to think about, and something that needs more research. It's difficult to do, but it's something that I think there is enough reason to do it because of the state of these sports. And more, we're seeing more deaths every year. So something has to change. We can't have these young athletes putting their lives on the line and being damaged or dying. If you guys have any questions beyond when we do the Q&A, I'm easy to find. If you can spell my name, you can find me. Just chris@chrisalgieri.com. You can email me anytime. We can discuss any of the things we talked about, get into more specifics. As Jose Antonio said at the top, I am the author of the book, The Fighter's Kitchen. If you want to pick it up, it's on Amazon. I suggest you do, because all proceeds go to me. And that's a good thing. But thank you guys very much. Any questions? I am available.
And real quick there, Chris.
Yeah.
You sort of alluded to it a little bit. You know, somebody asked a question in the Q&A, essentially looking at somebody losing weight as opposed to, you know, somebody who is weight cutting as opposed to weight loss over the course and injuries. You know, I sort of alluded to the idea that the weight cut itself, you know, obviously can be dangerous and lead to certain things, as you alluded to with some of those boxers. But in my mind, I think the overlooked aspect of this is the refuel and the rehydration, which you sort of hit on with the dehydration and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Could you sort of hit the commonality between all 3 of those boxers that you showed up there, that obviously were all injured, either death or, you know, essentially in a, you know, a bad state,
yeah,
in regards to what the regulations were based on the organization?
Yeah, perfect question. Thank you. So all 3 of those fighters were fighting in either organizations or states that required a same day of the fight weigh-in with a restriction on what their rehydration was. So meaning that they had a, look at this, absolute number of plus 10 pounds, regardless of the weight class. That is the IBF mandate, the International Boxing Federation's mandate for any of their title fights, that any athlete who weighs in can only gain 10 pounds leading up to the next day competition. They're weighed in the next day at noon. It's an absolute number. It's not a percentage, which I think is asinine. It doesn't make any sense. Also, I don't think there should be any restriction on rehydration. Each body is different, whatever your body needs in order to rehydrate and refuel. We rarely see fighters who injure other fighters because they've gained too much weight. It's generally the other way around. It's the guys that lose too much weight who get damaged, not the opposite of the fighter who's larger damaging the smaller fighter. So like I said, all three of those fighters historically cut a tremendous amount of weight, and I have spoke to their team about that. But I believe that the rehydration clause, based on either the state that they were fighting in or the IBF mandate, because two of those were title fights, I think could have a tremendous effect on the outcomes of what end up happening to those fighters, unfortunately.
Chris or
Yes.
Corey, there is one question here. In addition to nutrition and rest, have you found any form of manual treatment or therapy effective in recovery?
Yeah, I was actually just typing that, typing an answer to that, but I'll answer it out loud. I like the individual approach on this. Let's just use recovery. Recovery modalities in general. Let's look at cryo. Let's look at compression. Let's look at Graston cupping. Whatever the case might be. In my mind, especially following practice, following those kind of things, especially on two-a-days, in my mind, any form of recovery that's going to allow an athlete to work their way back to homeostasis at a more rapid rate, I'm on board for. Now, I know, a lot of people are going to go out there and say, like, look at there's research. When you look at something like cryotherapy, ice baths, and stuff like that, there's a ton of conflicting research, and I'm very aware of that. But if an athlete, even in terms of just perception of recovery, improves, and we can bring them back down to homeostasis, I'm on board. And what I mean by that, and why I say that, people like Tony, I know you can attest to this, spending tons of time in the fight gyms, if you don't pull these individuals off of the mats and provide something for them to do immediately, like recover, if that's not part of their program, then they're going to stay on the mats for another 2-3 hours, putting each other in chokeholds, kicks, punches, look at this move, look at this technique. I'm sorry, Chris, that makes you guys look bad as fighters, but so putting a structured recovery element in there that is going to bring them back down towards homeostasis, I'm on board for. But in terms of things that we've seen, a lot of the soft tissue techniques, a lot of the Theraguns and things like that, are being utilized a lot. A lot of the hands-on manual therapy, Graston cupping and things like that, even acupuncture with a lot of our athletes. These modalities are being utilized and in one way or another effective, whether it just be perception of recovery or whether there be actual measurables that are associated with it.
Corey brought up a great point, just kind of the systematic approach. And that's one thing that fighters don't have. Corey has come from a college football background. I was even a high school wrestler. Most boxers and fighters, they don't have that luxury. They don't come from playing major sports like football, where there is a systematic approach to recovery. So I look to the major sports. I look to baseball. I look to football. I look to the NFL. I look to the NBA. I look to what they provide to their athletes in forms of recovery, and try to mimic that for myself and for my athletes. So sports massage is something that is utilized by every one of those organizations I mentioned. Something I have used throughout my career, and during camp, I'm getting manual physical therapy once or twice a week, some weeks, especially as we're getting closer to the fight. I think that that has a tremendous effect on, what Corey said, getting back to homeostasis, where I can just lay down and relax and actually passively do something that's good for me. But also from a soft tissue, musculoskeletal stance, getting that body work, I think is tremendous, especially in a sport that there is so much contact and tissue turnover.
Okay. Gentlemen, can I add one thing to that, if I may?
Of course.
Also, too, this is you guys articulated it beautifully. And just quickly, in terms of recovery, I think we look at the periphery only a lot of times. So how do we recover the brain, the mind? Now, that's largely done during sleep, but I also think methods of meditation, progressive relaxation, deep breathing, even flotation tanks, which sometimes people mock, but sensory deprivation is actually a very good thing, so that, you know, we can get neuromotor processing. We learn, right, Chris, Corey, and Dr. Antonio, when we're not doing things, not when we're doing them. So I think in terms of recovery too, a nice thing, and I'll let Chris elaborate on it, but we can think of how to from the neuro side, how are we recovering to the brain side of that. And I think things like sensory deprivation, relaxation, less external stimuli after so much in camp can be advantageous.
I'm happy that you brought up the sensory deprivation tank. I have a standing Sunday sensory deprivation tank session every week. That's part of my training camp. And not only is it great to get away from this stupid thing, but it's great for your body just to sit in that Epsom salt for 90 minutes at a time and not do anything. It's very rare that you, in this modern day world, that you get to shut off any kind of external stimuli and just lie and rest. So I've been utilizing that for a while. It's helped me with my visualization, which is a mental technique that I have used since I started fighting 20 years ago. You know, constantly repeating fight night in my head, techniques that I've worked on, developing mantras that I will repeat over and over and over in my mind throughout camp, has been something that I've utilized for years. And I think that utilizing the sensory deprivation tanks, the float tanks, has only heightened my ability to mentally focus and develop the pathways of my mind to see victory.
Gentlemen, we got to wrap this up. So Dr. Peacock, if you have any final thoughts, Chris or Tony?
Got some good questions over here.
Yeah, I see that. I see the one about sleep quality. Let me answer that one really quickly, Dr. Antonio, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
Just briefly, I just want to give more of a practical look at this. I think it's funny because I don't know the answer to that question, but what I will say is this, you know, in terms of weight cutting and those kind of things, I think it's not always a great idea to come in and throw your approach on an athlete without getting to know them, getting to know some of the practices they've done before. I think that's a really important thing. You sort of tailor what they've done and add small tools as you go, you know, like I look at some of the people that I've worked with and where we're at 10 fights as opposed to 10 fights ago, or 10 fights together as opposed to 10 fights ago. We're a mile away from one another, but it was a gradual process to be able to get them to trust you and stuff like that. So I'm looking at this weight cutting and sleep quality in terms of risk of injuries question. And I look at somebody like Kamaru Usman, you know, I keep referring to him, but you know, it's one of the best fighters I have. Whether or not this weight reduction, weight cutting disrupts, you know, looks sleep injury and stuff like this. Kamaru's a guy that no matter how much time he has, like for instance, even this last fight, you know, he had more time the next day to actually cut weight. They weighed in middle of the day as opposed to the morning. He will cut all of his weight the night before, no matter what, because if he doesn't see the number on the scale, he'll obsess over it all night. He won't be able to sleep. He will get up. He can't do it. Even the thought of having, you know, like a lot of people, if they have that morning to cut the next day, a lot of them will lose, you know, squeeze out that last 6 to 7 pounds right before they step on the scale. Like Chris talked about, he wants to do it right before he steps on. Certain people, especially I think the wrestlers, a lot of times are the people that they need to see that number sooner than later. If not, they obsess over it. So again, yeah, it may play a role in performance and injury, but then again, I don't know if he would sleep at all without seeing that number on the scale. So again,
and I'm the opposite. When I am in a dehydrated state, I cannot sleep. I physiologically have trouble sleeping. It has nothing to do with my mind. So I will save a few pounds for the weight cut to the morning of the weigh-in. So I'll go to sleep a little bit heavy. I don't need to see the number on the scale. I know I'm going to make it. But I do want to sleep well the night before, which does have a dramatic effect on me in terms of my mood and even just physically. So I'd rather sleep the night before and then deal with it in the morning before stepping on the scale rather than doing what Kamaru does.
Yep. All right.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I want to let everyone know that the webinar was recorded. It should be available in a day or so, and they can email us through the ISSN site. And also, Chris and Corey, tell the audience where you could be reached easiest or the most, is it Instagram or Facebook?
I would say probably email for me. Instagram,
Okay.
I miss spots. So chris.algieri.com is the best way to email me. That'll go directly to me, and I usually get back to those pretty quick.
Yeah, if it's in terms of, potential research, Nova Southeastern master's program, reach me at cpeacock@nova.edu. If not, I would say probably Instagram at Dr. C. Peacock. I should be able to catch it. So.
And also, I want to let the audience know, I will see all of you at the ISSN conference in Daytona Beach. So you guys enjoy the rest of the day, and I want to thank the audience for listening. So great job, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.